Mark Donovan wiped his hands on a rag as he pushed the mop bucket down the long corridor of the Titan fusion facility. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above, casting pale shadows on the polished floors. It was early morning, and the place was already buzzing with the usual hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of engineers moving with purpose. Mark's job was simple. Some would say boring. Sweeping floors, emptying trash bins, cleaning up spills. But for him, it was enough to keep food on the table for his daughter, Lily, and pay the bills that seemed to grow taller each month. As he rounded the corner near Reactor 3, a group of young engineers leaned against a railing, talking and laughing. One of them, a tall man with a crisp uniform and a smug expression, noticed Mark and called out, "Hey, janitor! Did you come to clean the core today too, or just the coffee stains?" Mark smiled politely and nodded. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice calm. Inside, he felt the familiar sting of irritation. They had no idea who he really was or what he was capable of. They saw a cleaner in overalls, not a man who had fixed broken machines, improvised solutions in tight spaces, and solved problems that stumped even experienced technicians. But he had learned long ago that arguing with people like this never helped. He simply kept moving, pushing his mop quietly, letting their laughter fade behind him. He stopped at a small maintenance hatch near the reactor and crouched down, wiping a patch of spilled coolant from the floor. As he worked, he couldn't help noticing something odd. A faint vibration ran through the metal floor beneath him, almost like a pulse, and a soft, unusual hum filled the air. Mark paused and tilted his head, listening carefully. He had been around machines his whole life. His father had been an electrician, and Mark had learned the sounds of engines, motors, and turbines almost instinctively. This hum was new. It was subtle, easy to miss, but his gut told him something was off. The engineer's laughter faded as the hum grew slightly louder. Mark glanced up, watching them walk away, completely unaware. He straightened and adjusted the rag in his hand. No one else seemed to notice the tiny fluctuations in the reactor's energy monitors. Most people trusted the machines, the screens, the data. Mark had always trusted his instincts more than anything else. Machines could fail. Sensors could lie. People could be blind to what was happening right under their noses. He continued cleaning near the reactor, keeping one eye on the floor and the other on the blinking lights of the control panels. It was a delicate balance. He didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. He wasn't sure what he had sensed yet, but he couldn't ignore it either. Mark had learned early in life that small details often mattered the most. A loose bolt, a stray wire, a flickering light could be the start of a much bigger problem. The morning passed slowly. The usual routines repeated, the hum of machinery, the soft beeps from monitoring devices, and the occasional voice over the intercom. Mark mopped and swept, all while keeping his senses alert. Every so often, he leaned close to the floor panels or peeked through small observation windows, listening, feeling, thinking. The feeling of unease grew stronger, a quiet tension that wrapped around his thoughts. Something was building inside the reactor, something the others couldn't or wouldn't see. During lunch break, he sat alone in a quiet corner of the staff room, quietly eating the sandwich Lily had helped him pack that morning. His mind replayed the odd vibrations and the humming sound. Engineers joked about him being a janitor, but Mark didn't mind. They could laugh all they wanted. He knew that when it came to machines, knowledge, intuition, and observation were far more important than titles or uniforms. He had faced broken systems before, solved problems others ignored, and often done it quietly, unnoticed. Finishing his meal, Mark stood and placed the empty wrapper into the trash. He straightened his overalls and returned to his duties, passing once again by the group of engineers. They smirked and waved. "Hey, don't mop too hard. You might trigger the reactor," one of them joked. Mark chuckled softly, but inside he felt a small flame of determination. If something was really wrong, they would soon see that even a janitor could make a difference. As the afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, Mark returned to the reactor corridor. The vibration beneath his feet had grown slightly stronger. The hum, now more noticeable, made his skin tingle. He crouched again by the maintenance hatch, listening intently, trying to understand the rhythm of the machine. It spoke to him in a language of energy and motion. It was subtle, quiet, and only someone who paid attention to the smallest details could understand it. Mark realized something very important. This was not normal. And while the engineers mocked him, While the supervisors ignored minor anomalies, he knew that sometimes the smallest voice, or the hum of a machine, carried the biggest warnings. Today, he thought, his ordinary life might intersect with something extraordinary, and when it did, he would be ready. Mark Donovan moved carefully along the maintenance corridor, his mop bucket rattling softly against the metal floor. The hum from Reactor 3 was louder now, vibrating through the walls and under his boots. It was subtle, almost easy to ignore, but Mark had learned to trust these small signs. He had fixed engines, motors, and machines at home and at his previous jobs, and he knew when something was off before any alert appeared on a screen. Today, something was off. He stopped near a small service panel and crouched to inspect it. The metal was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been. He ran his fingers over the bolts and the pipes, feeling tiny vibrations that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the reactor's hum. His heart beat a little faster, not with fear but with focus. He had no tools to make repairs here yet, but he could at least observe, collect data with his own senses, and figure out what needed to be done before it became a real problem. The engineers passed by, walking quickly, their conversation full of technical jargon and laughter at the expense of someone in the cafeteria who had spilled coffee. They did not notice Mark. They did not notice the flicker of the warning light he had seen through the observation window. They were busy with their charts, their instruments, their pride. Mark shook his head slightly and returned to his careful inspection. He crouched closer to the floor and peeked through a small opening into the cooling system. Pipes twisted in a complex maze, carrying coolant that glowed faintly under the lights. He noticed a small valve that seemed slightly misaligned. It wasn't fully closed and it wasn't fully open either. It moved in a way that suggested a mechanical fault. To anyone else, it would have seemed unimportant, almost invisible. To Mark, it was a red flag. He had seen small problems like this cause big disasters before. Mark's mind raced. He thought of Lily at home, of her small hands reaching for his in the morning, of her laugh filling their tiny apartment. He thought of the sacrifices he had made. The nights spent cleaning, and Orcs' instincts told him that if the issue wasn't addressed quickly, it could escalate into something dangerous. He decided to leave the mop and bucket at the side of the corridor and move closer to the access tunnels. These narrow paths were not meant for casual visitors. Engineers rarely entered them unless there was a major repair, but Mark had walked these tunnels many times before, checking corners, cleaning panels, and sometimes just exploring. He knew the layout like the back of his hand. He moved carefully, ducking under pipes, stepping over cables, listening to the hum, following it as if it were a guide. As he progressed, he noticed other small anomalies. A pipe joint that had a tiny leak, condensation forming on a sensor that should have been dry, a faint vibration in a support beam. He took careful mental notes. To most people, these details would seem irrelevant, but Mark knew that small errors often cascaded into big problems. His mind worked like a machine itself, connecting dots, predicting consequences, calculating risks. He reached a junction that led directly beneath the reactor core. The hum was louder here, almost vibrating in his chest. He paused and closed his eyes for a moment, listening, feeling. The pulse was uneven, irregular. His instincts screamed that this was more than a minor glitch. Something was pushing the reactor out of balance. If left unchecked, the energy could spike. Pressure could build too quickly, and the safety systems might not react fast enough. Mark opened his eyes and began examining the nearest access panel. He could see the valve clearly now. It was small, easy to miss, but crucial. A tiny adjustment could stabilize the coolant flow and prevent further problems. But to do it safely, he would have to move quickly and carefully. One wrong move could damage the system or make the situation worse. He thought again of Lily and swallowed hard. He could not afford to hesitate. Time was passing and the hum was growing. Mark's hands worked almost automatically, remembering everything he had learned from years of fixing things. He adjusted his grip, checked the pressure gauges with a quick glance, and prepared to intervene. For a moment, he felt the weight of the facility above him, the engineers working obliviously, the machines humming in a rhythm he alone seemed to understand. It was strange, this quiet tension before action, a calm before a storm. But Mark was ready. He always was, even if the world didn't notice. As he reached toward the valve, a faint warning light blinked on the console above him. The engineers in the control room would see it soon, but by then, it might already be too late. Mark knew he couldn't wait for their approval. This was his responsibility now. One small man, one ordinary janitor standing beneath the core of a massive reactor, about to decide if disaster would strike or be averted. The alarm started with a low, steady beep, almost polite at first, but quickly grew louder, shrill and urgent. Mark's ears twitched at the sound, his instincts sharpening. He had seen warning lights before, but these were different. Red flashes pulsed across the control panels above, and the vibration beneath his feet had increased. The reactor was reacting, and not in a normal way. In the control room, engineers scrambled, tapping screens, calling out to each other, but most of them still assumed it was a minor glitch. They did not notice Mark moving carefully beneath the reactor, his hands steady, eyes focused. He crouched by the small valve, assessing the pressure gauges. His mind worked quickly. A valve slightly out of alignment, a small fluctuation in coolant flow, a rise in temperature. They all pointed to the same thing. If he did nothing, the reactor could escalate into a dangerous state in seconds. Mark glanced around the narrow maintenance shaft. There was no time to waste. He adjusted his grip on the valve, turning it carefully. The metal was hot, but not dangerously so. He could feel the subtle vibration through his fingers, almost like the heartbeat of the machine. It was irregular, uneven. He knew that even a small correction now could prevent disaster. Above him, the alarms grew louder. He could hear voices from the control room, distant and frantic. One engineer shouted, "Check the cooling loop. Pressure's rising too fast." Another argued, "It's impossible, it should be stable." Mark ignored them. Their charts and calculations were reacting to what had already started. But he had the advantage of being on the ground, literally feeling the machine, understanding it in a way no monitor could. He made a small adjustment to the valve, turning it a fraction more than usual. Instantly, he felt a change, a small relief in the vibration, a faint easing of the hum. It was not fully stabilized yet, but it was enough to prevent immediate danger. Mark didn't pause. He reached for the coolant bypass panel, a complicated set of pipes and levers that most engineers would avoid unless they were performing a major repair. He had memorized its layout during months of cleaning, observing and exploring. The temperature gauge flickered, showing a slight drop as coolant began to flow more evenly. Mark's heart pounded, but his movements were calm, precise. He worked with a confidence built from years of observation, intuition, and quiet determination. Every twist of a valve, every slight push of a lever mattered. The reactor's rhythm began to respond, slowly, cautiously, like a patient regaining its balance after a stumble. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared from the main console, piercing and urgent. A voice echoed over the intercom. "Emergency! Reactor 3 is unstable. Evacuate non-essential personnel immediately." Mark froze for a moment, listening. This was serious. Very serious. If the engineers didn't act fast, the reactor could overheat. The safety systems might trigger a partial shutdown, and the consequences could be catastrophic. He took a deep breath and continued. His hands moved with careful speed, adjusting multiple valves and rerouting coolant flow through secondary lines. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he didn't stop. He was a single dad, a cleaner, a man who had always solved problems quietly. Now his life experience, his instincts, and his courage were all needed in this one moment. In the control room, panic had spread. Engineers were running from console to console, shouting numbers and warnings. Yet no one had realized the simple cause of the instability. It was a mechanical issue, a small misalignment, something Mark had sensed long before the alarms rang. He alone was in the right place at the right time, capable of acting faster than any protocol or automated system. As the seconds ticked by, the pressure began to stabilize. The temperature gauge slowly leveled off. The hum beneath Mark's feet became smoother, less jagged. He allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but he did not stop. One more adjustment, one final check, and the reactor seemed to respond completely. The intense, sharp vibrations faded into the normal, rhythmic pulse of a well-functioning machine. Mark stood, wiping sweat from his brow, and glanced upward. The alarms were still sounding, but now the readings on the monitors showed stability. The crisis had passed, or at least the worst of it had. Engineers ran past him in a frenzy, unaware of who had prevented disaster. One of them shouted over the intercom, "We're stabilizing the core, but how?" Mark simply picked up his mop, quietly returning to his usual routine as if nothing had happened. Inside, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. He had faced something dangerous, something that could have harmed countless people. And he had solved it using nothing more than observation, intuition, and calm determination. The engineers would take credit, protocols would be written, and alarms would be analyzed, but Mark knew the truth. A single dad, a cleaner, had stopped a reactor meltdown in seconds. As he continued along the corridor, pushing his mop bucket, he thought of Lily waiting at home. He smiled to himself, knowing that in a world full of machines, alarms, and people who underestimated him, human courage and insight still mattered. Mark Donovan walked slowly down the long corridor, his mop bucket rattling softly behind him. The reactor hum had returned to its normal, steady rhythm, and the harsh blaring of alarms had faded. The emergency lights blinked in a slow pattern, casting long shadows along the walls. He could hear voices echoing from the control room, engineers calling out numbers, instructions, and frantic observations, but none of them noticed him. To them, he was just a cleaner, quietly moving through the facility like always. He paused for a moment near a corner, listening to the chatter. One engineer was repeating over the intercom, "We stabilized the core. The readings are back to normal." Others were clapping each other on the back, congratulating one another for their quick reaction. Mark shook his head slightly, smiling to himself. They had no idea that the real work, the intervention that had prevented disaster, had already been done before they even realized the situation was serious. He moved closer to the reactor corridor, glancing at the panels he had adjusted moments ago. The temperature readings were steady, the pressure lines smooth. Everything looked normal, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Mark wiped his brow with the back of his hand and crouched by the valve one last time just to check. Everything was in place. The vibration beneath his feet was even, the hum steady. The reactor was safe. As he straightened up, the group of engineers who had mocked him earlier appeared at the end of the corridor. They were moving quickly, their faces pale but animated, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and relief. One of them, the tall man who had called him a janitor earlier, froze when he saw Mark. "Wait, you were down there?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Mark nodded quietly, keeping his expression calm. "I noticed the valve wasn't aligned properly," he said simply. "The coolant flow was uneven. I adjusted it and rerouted some lines. The readings should stabilize now." The engineers stared at him, stunned. Their mouths opened, closed, and opened again. One of them finally muttered, "You fixed it, the reactor. You saved it?" Mark shrugged. "I just did what needed to be done," he said. His voice was steady, but inside he felt a quiet pride. He wasn't looking for praise. He had done it for the reactor, for the people who worked there, and most importantly, for the people outside who depended on the facility to remain safe. The tall engineer took a hesitant step forward. "But how? You're a cleaner. You're not trained for this." Mark smiled faintly. "I've been around machines my whole life. I watch, I listen, I notice small things. That's all it takes sometimes." A supervisor appeared from the control room, her face serious, her eyes sharp. "Mark Donovan," she said, her tone carefully measured. "We need to know exactly what you did. The facility's emergency protocols don't allow for improvisation like this. Explain yourself." Mark calmly walked over to the main panel, pointing out the small adjustments he had made. "The valve here," he said, "was partially stuck. It caused the coolant to flow unevenly. I turned it slightly, then rerouted some lines to balance the system. The vibration and temperature readings returned to normal afterward." The supervisor frowned, studying the panels, then looked back at the engineers. "It appears he's correct," she said quietly. The engineers exchanged guilty glances. Their earlier confidence and laughter had evaporated in an instant. They had relied on monitors, screens, and procedures, but it had taken Mark's careful observation and quick thinking to actually prevent the disaster. Mark stepped back and picked up his mop, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The engineers were still staring, trying to reconcile the truth with their assumptions. One of them muttered, We thought he was just cleaning." Another shook his head. "How did we miss this? We were monitoring everything." Mark shrugged again, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Sometimes watching isn't enough. You have to feel the machine, understand it, notice the little things." The supervisor nodded slowly, a mixture of respect and surprise in her eyes. "Mark Donovan," she said, "you may have just prevented a serious accident. We will document everything, and your actions will be recognized. But more importantly, This is a reminder that insight and observation are just as important as formal training. Mark nodded politely, not letting the praise overwhelm him. Recognition was nice, but it wasn't the reason he did what he did. He thought of Lily, waiting at home, and felt a quiet warmth. Saving a reactor wasn't about glory. It was about responsibility, about understanding the world, and about acting when it mattered most. As the engineers returned to their consoles, still shaken, Mark continued his cleaning route, quietly wiping the floors and adjusting stray panels. The facility was safe again, and he had done his part. The tension in the air gradually faded, replaced by relief but also by a new awareness. The people around him had been reminded that courage and skill didn't always come with a uniform or a title. By the end of his shift, Mark was tired, but satisfied. He left the facility quietly, pushing his mop bucket down the empty hallways, thinking of the warm dinner waiting for him and Lily's bright smile at home. Today had been extraordinary, but in a way only he fully understood. The world might not always see the quiet heroes, the ones who worked behind the scenes, but he knew the truth. Ordinary people could do extraordinary things when it mattered most. The next morning, Mark Donovan arrived at the Titan Fusion facility to find an unusual buzz in the air. Engineers and supervisors were talking quietly in corners, their voices filled with a mix of curiosity, relief, and a hint of respect. Word had spread quickly about what had happened yesterday, though most still only had fragments of the story. Mark pushed his mop bucket down the familiar corridor, trying to act as if it was just another day, but he could feel eyes on him, watching from behind control panels and doorways. He passed the control room where a small group of engineers were gathered around the main console. One of them, the tall engineer who had mocked him before, turned toward him with a hesitant smile. "Morning, Mark," he said, his voice careful. I guess I owe you an apology. Yesterday, we were wrong. You actually saved the reactor." Mark nodded politely, keeping his expression neutral. "It's okay," he said simply. What mattered was that the reactor was safe. Inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He didn't need their approval, but it was strange to hear respect in the voices of people who had laughed at him just a day ago. The supervisor who had spoken to him yesterday stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Mark Donovan, I want you to come to the meeting room immediately. There's something you need to hear." He followed her down the corridor, curiosity mixing with cautious excitement. Inside the meeting room, several senior engineers and facility managers waited. The room fell silent as he entered. One of the managers cleared his throat. "Mark," he said, "your actions yesterday were extraordinary. We have reviewed the data, and it's clear that your quick thinking and manual adjustments prevented a potentially serious accident. We want to officially recognize you for your work." Mark blinked, surprised. Recognition had never been his goal. He had acted because it was necessary, because it was the right thing to do. But hearing it acknowledged by people in authority brought a warm feeling of pride. "Thank you," he said quietly. The manager continued. "We are implementing new procedures to ensure that operators pay closer attention to subtle signs in the reactor systems. Your experience and insight have reminded us that machines alone are not enough. Human observation matters. You will also be invited to training sessions and briefings so your input can help prevent future issues." Mark nodded, listening carefully. He realized that this was not just recognition for yesterday. It was an opportunity to change the way people thought about safety, responsibility, and human skill. Even a cleaner someone often overlooked could make a difference. As he left the meeting room, he noticed the engineers watching him with a new kind of respect. Some nodded as he passed, others smiled awkwardly, unsure how to interact with someone they had underestimated. Mark walked past them with his usual quiet confidence. He didn't need their praise, but it was nice to see that actions, not titles, were finally being recognized. Later, as he returned to the reactor corridor, he paused for a moment to look at the complex machinery he had saved. The hum was steady, the pipes cool and secure. He ran his fingers lightly over a valve he had adjusted, feeling the subtle vibrations beneath his fingertips. Machines were predictable in ways that humans were not, but humans had the advantage of intuition, creativity, and the ability to notice the unexpected. He smiled to himself, knowing that this truth had been proven yesterday. By midday, a few engineers approached him with questions about the adjustments he had made. They asked about the valves, the coolant flow, and the maintenance panels. Mark explained carefully. using simple language and clear examples. They listened, taking notes, their faces filled with curiosity and eagerness. For the first time, he felt like his experience mattered, not just his job title. When lunch break came, Mark sat alone at a quiet table as usual, but today he felt different. A junior engineer approached him with a sandwich in hand. "Hey," she said nervously, "I heard about what you did." "Thanks, really. I don't think any of us would have noticed in time." Mark smiled, taking the sandwich politely. "Thank you," he said. "It's good to know someone understands." Inside, he felt warmth not just from recognition, but from the simple human connection. His life had always been about responsibility, his daughter, his job, his own sense of right and wrong. Now others were beginning to see that ordinary people could have extraordinary impact. By the end of the day, Mark finished his cleaning duties and prepared to leave the facility. He looked back once at the reactor corridor, feeling a sense of quiet pride. He had acted quickly, relied on his instincts, and prevented disaster. But more importantly, he had reminded everyone that courage and intelligence were not measured by job titles. As he walked out of the facility, mop bucket in hand, he thought of Lily waiting at home. Today she would hear that her dad wasn't just a cleaner. He was someone who had saved lives, someone who had used his skill, observation, and calm thinking to make a difference. And that thought made him smile as he stepped into the sunlight, ready to return to the ordinary life that had just become a little more extraordinary. The days after the reactor incident passed in a blur of quiet attention. Mark Donovan arrived at the Titan fusion facility to find subtle but meaningful changes. Engineers who once ignored him now nodded politely as he walked past. Supervisors occasionally stopped to ask a question about maintenance schedules or system checks, and even the junior staff approached him with genuine curiosity. He carried on with his cleaning duties as usual, but the atmosphere had shifted. People had started to see that titles and uniforms were not the only measure of ability or value. Mark moved through the familiar corridors, mop in hand, paying attention to the hum of the machines and the small vibrations under his feet. The reactor seemed calm, almost serene after the recent chaos, but Mark knew better than to let himself relax completely. Machines, even the most advanced, could fail if someone stopped noticing the details. He paused near a junction beneath Reactor 3, recalling the tension he had felt during the emergency. The memory made him realize how thin the line had been between a minor glitch and a disaster. He had acted quickly, trusting his instincts and knowledge of the facility, but it had been close. Later that morning, a senior engineer called him to a newly arranged meeting. Mark followed quietly, unsure of what to expect. Inside, the room was filled with engineers, managers, and even safety officers from other facilities. The air buzzed with curiosity and respect, and Mark felt a strange mix of nervousness and calm. He had never been part of such a gathering before, but he knew that this time, his voice mattered. The senior engineer began, "Mark, yesterday you reminded us all that human observation and intuition are as important as our monitoring systems. We want to learn from your approach, your ability to notice subtle signs and act decisively. We're asking you to participate in a series of training sessions and briefings to help others develop the same awareness you demonstrated." Mark nodded, accepting the offer. It was unusual for a cleaner to have such responsibility, but he understood the importance. He thought of the younger engineers, many of whom had laughed at him days before. Now he had the chance to teach them that paying attention, thinking critically, and trusting one's instincts could save lives. During the session, Mark explained the small details that had caught his attention. The vibration in the floor, the subtle hum of the machinery, the slightly misaligned valve, and how these clues had pointed to a potential meltdown. He spoke clearly, using simple language and relatable examples. The engineers listened attentively, asking questions, taking notes, and occasionally nodding in understanding. Mark felt a quiet satisfaction. Knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied, and he was helping others see what he had always known, that ordinary people could notice extraordinary things. As the week went on, Mark's role in the facility subtly expanded. He was asked to review maintenance logs, suggest minor improvements, and even test some of the early warning systems. He worked quietly, never seeking recognition, but he noticed the change in attitude among the staff. Engineers who had once mocked him now treated him as a respected colleague. Supervisors sought his opinion on small adjustments, and junior staff began approaching him with questions about troubleshooting and observation techniques. One afternoon, Mark walked past the reactor control room and paused to observe the engineers working. He noticed how carefully they monitored the gauges, how they double-checked connections, and how they responded quickly to small fluctuations. He smiled to himself, realizing that his actions had created a ripple effect. His quiet courage and careful observation had not only prevented a disaster, but had also inspired a new culture of attentiveness and responsibility throughout the facility. By the end of the week, Mark returned to his regular cleaning route. Pushing his mop bucket down the long corridors, he moved through the facility with the same calm, steady attention as before, but now there was a sense of purpose beyond the ordinary. He understood that heroism didn't always come with applause or recognition. Sometimes it was quiet behind the scenes, felt only in the subtle improvements, the safer environment, and the people who had learned to see differently. As he finished cleaning near Reactor 3, Mark paused for a moment and ran his fingers over the valve he had adjusted. The vibration beneath his fingertips was smooth, steady, and safe. He thought of Lily waiting at home, her smile and laughter filling his thoughts. He knew that in her eyes he was already a hero, and that was enough. Walking out of the facility that evening, Mark felt the sunlight warm his back. He carried his mop bucket through the empty parking lot, thinking about the changes in the facility and the people around him. He had proven that human insight, patience, and courage could match even the most advanced machines, and though the world might never fully understand the quiet heroes like him, he knew the truth. Ordinary people with careful observation and courage could do extraordinary things. Mark paused by his car, looking at the sky streaked with orange and pink. Today had been another ordinary day for the world, but extraordinary for those who had learned to see what he saw. He unlocked the car, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. As he drove home, he imagined Lily running to greet him, unaware of the challenges he had faced that week. And he knew that, as always, he would be ready to act, quietly, calmly, and with the steady courage that had kept the reactor safe and would continue to keep it safe, long into the future. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as Mark Donovan pushed his mop bucket down the familiar corridors of the Titan fusion facility. The hum of the reactors was steady and calm, a gentle rhythm that had once been unpredictable and dangerous. Today, everything seemed peaceful. Mark's routine had returned to normal, but he knew the world had changed, if only slightly because of him. Engineers passed him in the corridor, some nodding politely, others offering small smiles. He returned the gestures quietly, carrying on with his cleaning. Even though he had prevented a disaster, he did not walk with a sense of pride or superiority. To him, the work was not about recognition. It was about responsibility. It was about noticing details others ignored, acting when it mattered most, and keeping people safe. Earlier in the day, the facility managers had called a brief meeting to review the safety improvements implemented after the reactor incident. Mark had been invited, of course, and he had quietly offered advice on monitoring and observation practices. Engineers who had once mocked him now listened intently as he explained simple ways to watch machines for small anomalies, how to interpret vibrations, subtle sounds, and minor fluctuations in temperature and pressure. His input had been practical, grounded in real-world experience rather than textbook theory, and it had been valued. Now, finishing his last sweep of the corridor, Mark paused by the large observation window overlooking Reactor 3. The reactor's core glowed faintly, its energy flowing smoothly through the system. The hum beneath his feet was steady, almost soothing. He remembered the tension of the previous week, the sudden alarms, the warnings flashing red, the knowledge that every second counted. He had acted quickly and calmly, relying on his instincts, his knowledge, and the careful attention he had always given to machines. That moment had changed everything for him. Mark leaned lightly on his mop, his eyes following the intricate network of pipes, wires, and panels. The engineers had begun to adopt a new approach, checking systems more carefully, paying attention to the smallest details, and respecting the insight that sometimes came from unexpected sources. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that his actions had created more than just immediate safety. They had inspired change. As he finished cleaning, he walked toward the exit of the facility. The evening air was cool and calm, and he inhaled deeply, feeling a sense of relief and completeness. His job as a cleaner would continue. His routine would remain largely the same, but he carried something new with him, a quiet awareness that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when it mattered most. He drove home slowly, thinking of Lily. She had spent the evening drawing pictures and writing little notes for him, unaware of the events that had unfolded that week. Mark smiled at the thought of her small hands, her laughter, and her excitement as she told him about her day. Heroism, he realized, did not always need applause. Sometimes it was enough to know that the right thing had been done, quietly, effectively, and without recognition. Pulling into the driveway of their small apartment, he saw Lily waiting on the steps, her face lighting up as she spotted him. "Daddy!" she shouted, running toward him. He dropped his keys into his pocket and scooped her up, holding her close for a moment. Her warmth, her trust, and her love reminded him why he had acted so decisively at the reactor. Not for glory, not for praise, but for the people who depended on him, the lives that could be affected by his choices. Inside, they shared a simple dinner, talking and laughing about their day. Mark listened to her stories, helped with homework, and tucked her into bed as he always did. Yet tonight, there was a sense of accomplishment and quiet pride he could feel but not explain. The world outside might never fully know the details of what he had done, and that was fine. The important part was that people were safe. Lessons had been learned, and he had done his part. Later, as he sat in the small living room reflecting on the events, Mark realized something profound. Human insight, patience, and courage were irreplaceable. Machines could monitor, predict, and calculate, but they could not feel the subtle vibrations, notice the small changes, or act instinctively in a crisis. That was uniquely human. That was why, in moments that truly mattered, ordinary people, like a single dad and a cleaner, could accomplish extraordinary things. Mark glanced at the clock and then at the small pile of notes Lily had left him. Pictures of their day, small drawings and words written in her uneven handwriting. He smiled and placed them on the table, a reminder of why he continued to act with care, attention, and courage. His life was ordinary in many ways, but the impact he had made was extraordinary. The night grew quiet, the city lights twinkling through the windows, and Mark leaned back in his chair, thinking of the future. The facility would continue to operate, the engineers would continue to learn, and he would continue his work. But now there was a new awareness in the air, a respect for human insight, a recognition that anyone, no matter how ordinary they seemed, could change the course of events in critical moments. Mark Donovan, the single dad, the cleaner, the quiet observer, smiled to himself. Today had been a reminder that heroism was not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and unseen by the world, but it was real, and it mattered. With that thought, he finally stood, stretching his tired muscles, and looked at the small apartment where Lily slept peacefully. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The reactor was safe. People had learned. And he had done what mattered most, acted when it counted, trusted himself, and made a difference. Outside, the night was calm, full of possibilities, and full of ordinary people ready to do extraordinary things. If only they noticed the signs, trusted their instincts, and acted. Mark Donovan had proven it, and in the quiet strength of that proof, the world was a little safer and a little better because of him.